Well, thanks again to everyone for coming today to our latest in the series of On the Issues conversations. We've been trying to invite newsmakers, policy shapers into the law school on a regular basis, and so we're glad you could all be with us today. Our guest today is Charles Sykes. He's a familiar name and face to a lot of you. He is best known, I guess, perhaps, for his talk radio show on Radio 620 WTMJ here in Milwaukee. He is also the host of a Sunday morning talk show on my old station, today's TMJ4. Charlie has written a number of books. I think we're now up to 6. Is that correct? 6 books. We'll talk about his latest one for a couple of minutes. He's also a fellow with the Wisconsin Policy Research Institute. So you've got a busy life. And you write for newspapers, too. So how do you balance all of that?
That's a good question. Maybe I should just try to simplify my life a little bit, or maybe it's a continuum, because once you start having opinions about things, it just sort of flows out, and the writing flows into the talking. And I've always thought that when I made the transition from writing to talking, all writers think that people who are on television or radio are somehow lightweights. Actually, the reality is that when you have to talk, you have to be much more concise. You don't get to sit and ponder over your words and everything, edit it. So what I found is that actually writing helps me clarify what I think about things. So it doesn't seem that bad.
I mentioned 6 books now. The latest one is the one that I have here, 50 Rules Kids Won't Learn in School, Real-World Antidotes to the Feel-Good Education that you feel we see so much of today. I want to ask you about the motivations for writing this book. First of all, how's it doing? How's it selling?
It's doing very well because in some ways it was pre-marketed, because for about 10 years some of those rules were circulated, but they were attributed to Bill Gates.
In a commentary,
right,
on a show I think I might have been anchoring at the time. You did it.
It was your show.
First Rules.
That's right.
And where did the rules come from?
That's a great question. Where does anything come from? No, I'd written 2 books, one Nation of Victims, one Dumbing Down Our Kids, and these were just sort of themes that ran through the book. That life isn't fair, get used to it, that the world won't care as much about your self-esteem as your school does. Your school may have done away with winners and losers, life hasn't, things like that. And I essentially kind of wrote those off the top of my head because I'd been talking about those with the 2 books, and wrote that up into a column. Somehow that got picked up on the internet, and somebody thought, I think it was because of the rule that said, be nice to nerds, because you could end up working for them. Mm-hmm. And somebody thought, okay, well, Bill Gates is the world's most successful nerd, so he must have written this. So it began circulating. So in some ways they've been pre-marketed. And I also think that the book kind of touches a nerve because it is so kind of countercultural. Mm-hmm. It's very much, as I say in the book, the world is full of touchy-feely books of affirmation. This is not one of them.
You refer to this generation as the bubble wrap generation. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, bubble wrapping it's the idea that kids are so frail and they're so fragile that we have to protect them from any of the bumps and the bruises and the disappointments of life, that we have to make sure that they get the gold stars and the happy face, that everybody gets a medal, that their self-esteem must be protected from every possible blow. Well, the problem with bubble wrapping is that it assumes that you're going to stay bubble wrapped forever, or that you're not actually going to have to encounter life. And the bubble wrapping, I mean, it's the kind of the analogy of the boy that grows up in the bubble. They don't develop an immune system. Well, if a bubble wrap kid at some point may have high self-esteem, may be happy, but are they prepared for the fact that life is tough? That you're going to have to encounter losing. You're going to have to encounter frustrations. You're going to have to encounter frustration and criticism at some point in life. And so I guess the question is whether or not we're actually preparing kids to be adults, as opposed to kind of our buddies, our friends, keep them entertained this week, as opposed to thinking, okay, what are they going to be when they're 24, they're 25, and they're in law school, and they have a professor who actually expects them to know the cases, or they go into political science and they have to have John McAdams asking them tough questions about American political history.
You have 50 rules, but surely you have favorites. Do you have any favorites you care to share with us today?
Well, it depends what mood I'm in. I mean, honestly, there are some of the rules that, the rules about, you're not entitled. No matter what your daddy says, you're not a princess. Sometimes those are my favorites. There are There's a lot of that going around, by the way. The you're offended, so what? No, really, so what? Where say, look, the reality is that you don't have a right not to be offended in our society. If you really don't want to be offended, hear ideas and words that you don't like, you probably ought to go into a monastery as opposed to take public transit or go to a university or listen to talk radio. And then there's some others near the end of the book, though, that I've kind of admitted are kind of the kinder and gentler rules. In certain moods, those are my favorites too.
I want to go back to what you were saying about this bubble wrap mentality, because I was struck by this in the book. You write, even as evidence mounts that we have created a generation of smug, self-satisfied, entitled wimps, disconnected from reality and unprepared for the tests that the world has in store for them, legions of educationists, therapists, counselors, victimologists, bureaucrats, and parents continue to obsess about how to pump up the self-esteem and bubble wrap the feelings of the younger generation. Do you think you sound like a grumpy old man here?
Actually, that's actually one of my favorite paragraphs of the whole book. In fact, the next paragraph says, this book is dedicated to exactly the opposite, that in fact what people need is exactly the opposite thing. And yeah, in answer to your question, oh yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things, if I actually worried about whether I sounded like a grumpy old guy, I wouldn't have written the book.
You quote a commentator who writes for U.S. News and World Report, and also I think it's on the Fox News channel, Michael Barone, who describes America really having become a divided nation, and there's a hard America, as he refers to it, and a soft America. I assume you buy that description of what we've become. What does he mean by that?
Well, Barone, who I think is probably the most brilliant political writer in America today, he's just an extraordinary guy, says that there's a paradox in American society that for the first 18 years of life, we're in soft America. We have schools that are really designed not to challenge, not to demand too much, kind of the bubble wrapping thing that I talk about, the therapeutic culture. And yet by the age of 30, Americans are incredibly self-reliant. They're incredibly tough. You look at the people who are in the military, the people who in fact are driving the economy. And he says this is one of the paradoxes of American life, that we do have these two Americas side by side. And of course one of the questions is whether one leads into the other or whether they're in some sort of conflict or juxtaposition with one another.
You fall into the hard America camp, obviously, in this, and maybe this is a good point to transition into what you do today.
Yeah.
Your role and how you perceive your role. As a talk radio host, as a television host, is the role to entertain, is the role to enlighten, is the role to actually shape and change policy? All of the above.
All of the above, but probably pretty much in the order that you listed them at. I
Entertainment
think,
first.
Well, what's the opposite of entertainment? Being boring? I mean, I just don't think you have a moral obligation to be boring. I know there are people out there who are saying, no, can you be just as dry and dull as we are? Well, no, thanks for the input, but no, actually, I'd rather not be. I suppose when I first started doing it, I probably was in the third camp, and I think that probably that's changed over the years because, if you try to change the world, you're not necessarily going to. So what I try to do is I try to express my point of view. I try to draw out different points of view. I try to be provocative, but I also, somebody asked me the other day, says, do you believe everything you say on the air? And the answer is, well, of course I do. I mean, I can't be on the air for 3.5 hours a day and not actually believe what I'm saying, because otherwise I'd forget from day to day. It's like, when you're a liar, you really have to have a good memory because you wouldn't know what you said the day before. But I think all of those things.
How much clout do you think you carry? And I asked that, there was, and you've talked about this recently, there was a commentary written by a gentleman by the name of Bill Krause. Bill Krause was a former aide to Republican Governor Lee Dreyfus. I know Bill Krause, he considers himself a Republican. I've actually talked with him about that, why he feels that way. He wrote about you in the last week or so, or a couple of weeks ago. He said, Charlie not only defines Republicanism, he runs the admissions department. If you claim to be a Republican and you do not accept the Sykes agenda in toto and to the letter, he brands you as a rhino, Republican in name only, or worse. The question is not whether Charlie has the right to do this. The question is why the Republicans believe him and are deathly afraid of Charlie's censure. That would suggest that you carry a heck of a lot of power.
Can I just, brothers? The best part of this is the headline. The Republican Sykes problem. which I thought was pretty flattering. So I actually posted this, and this was kind of flattering. I thought it was kind of weird too, that he would suggest that. He goes on to basically say that he doesn't understand it because, of course, no Republicans live in southeastern Wisconsin, and all Republicans are at work when I'm on the show. So why would this be an issue? Which suggests to me that he's kind of missing the point that the problem isn't me. It's that obviously there are people who listen who agree. And that's part of the thing is in radio, anybody can turn on the microphone. It doesn't mean you actually have any credibility. I guess the problem is that I don't define myself as a Republican. What annoys a lot of Republicans is the fact that I actually hold them to some standard that if you run for office claiming you are something, you ought to do it. And if you're running for office and you say A and you get into office and you say B, I'm going to call you on it. And there are some Republicans who obviously think, no, you don't understand. It's teamwork, or we should all be on the same deal. And I say, that's not my deal. I'm a conservative. I have certain principles. I'm generally going to agree with Republicans because how many conservative Democrats can you name? If we could, take up a collection here, but. To that extent, I do think that there are obviously listeners in southeastern Wisconsin who say, all right, we don't have an allegiance to a political party. We have an allegiance to certain ideas, and we're going to listen to, if I call somebody out on their inconsistencies.
You say you don't see yourself as a Republican,
No.
and yet that's what critics would say.
Sure.
They say you're a toady for the Republican Party. You carry water for the Republican Party.
That's not the
every
worst thing
election
they say.
cycle.
I mean, we could, toady is the mild ones. Those are, we just start the list,
What do you say to those folks who say that? Just listen to them every day.
Yeah.
You can't say a good word about a Democrat, and you can't say a bad word about a Republican.
Well, see, that's why guys like Bill Krause are writing this, because I do say bad words about Republicans, but not from the point of view of the people that disagree with me. I'll say that a Republican who gets into office saying, I'm going to stand up for you, and then they go to Madison or Washington, and they start getting into the pork barrel spending, or they begin, favoring tax increases. In terms of Democrats, I'm a huge fan of Joe Lieberman. Unfortunately, the reality is that we've become a very, very polarized society. And there used to be a larger number of people in both political parties who I think, would cross over. There are Democrats in Wisconsin who are more conservative than most Republicans. There is a guy, Bob Ziegelbauer, from Manitowoc, who actually is quite conservative, and I've had on my show and I will talk about. But, here's the reality of what I do. And I really think I have made peace with this, that if you are going to engage in controversy, if you do stick your head up above the foxhole, people will shoot back. And I expect the criticism on that. And obviously, I guess I make the balance that I'd rather be criticized. I'd rather have Bill Krause talking about the Republican Sykes problem or the Democrat Sykes problem or my Sykes problem than to have people go, Sykes who? That would be not preferable.
Do you think, you mentioned the polarization in America, do you think talk radio plays any part in that, whether it's liberal talk radio or conservative talk radio?
Yeah, there's not much liberal talk radio. I mean,
What's left?
Yeah, that's that's public radio, but there's a polarization in American society. It's hard to identify one thing. Look, I mean, one of the things that's changed since you and I got in the media. I mean, we can kind of remember when the media was 1 or 2 newspapers, 3 television stations, and that's pretty much it. Now you have all of the cable stations. You have the internet. You have about 1 million blogs. You have this proliferation of voices. You have people out there who would never have been made their voices heard, being able to speak and drawing constituencies about it. So the fact is that we do have more voices than ever before. Talk radio is just one of the voices. Is it one of the voices that contributes to the polarization? Well, yeah, there's no question about it, yes. I mean, because there is more debate, there is a livelier debate, there's a more contentious debate than ever before. I personally think that to the extent that there is a lot of debate, that's a good thing. The overall polarization, I guess I'm not going to plead guilty that we are totally responsible for that.
I mention that because, I mean, there are not, you're right, a lot of liberal talk radio folks, but there are a few, Randy Rhodes, and I think there's an Ed Schultz who does a program. There are a few. And you have people sometimes who go to extremes, and I'm interested to hear what you think of a guy like Michael Savage, who, when I used to drive home from work late at night, I'd
Yeah.
listen to him sometimes, and he would refer to members of the Supreme Court as vermin.
Yeah.
Does that go too far? Are
Yes.
there lines that
Yeah.
you feel just you cannot cross in public discourse?
Yeah, and I think that happens on both sides. I think Michael Savage goes way too far. I think Michael Savage is an embarrassment. If it was up to me, he wouldn't be on our station.
I want to talk about
That was off the record, by the way.
I want to talk about something that you often hear when you listen to talk radio, and that is about the mainstream media and the media template. You used to work as a reporter at City Hall. Did you feel you were pressured to bias a story, to take a certain angle to a story? Did you feel that at the time that you were doing that?
No, I think it's more subtle. But having said no, let me just continue the thought because I'm not saying absolutely not. I think that there is a group mentality in the media, just like there is in any profession, that there is a culture when certain things are encouraged, certain things are popular, and certain things are looked down upon. I knew that in the newsroom, that if you did a story that was critical of certain people, that you would be lauded, you'd be very popular, and you would get good play. If you wrote a story that was favorable to that same person, people would look at you like, what's wrong with you? Are you a lousy reporter or are you a sellout? So I think a part of it is not that the editor sits and says, okay, here is our agenda on this. I think what you have is you have a group of people who share a similar cultural and political background, and they feed upon one another. And quite frankly, I mean, from time to time, when I talk to people in the media and they are adamantly, we have no bias whatsoever, I believe them that they don't see it, that they believe they swim in an ocean of people who think just like them, and they don't realize that in fact, they carry all of these assumptions, what they emphasize, what they don't emphasize, the themes, the templates that they have. You see that, I think, on the macro level and on the micro level.
In your mind, how pervasive is liberal bias in the media, mainstream media?
I think it is pervasive, and I think it's gotten worse. I think it is more aggressive. I think that you see on the part of many of the major networks and papers like the New York Times a real crossing over into a, look, this is what we are. The lines between advocacy and editorialism, I think, get blurred. That's not universal, by the way, but I mean, I do think it's extremely widespread.
Let me turn this around because something that I started to see more at the tail end of my career was people who held viewpoints on the left side of the political spectrum saying, what is all this talk about liberal bias? Media ownership is consolidated now into very few hands. It's a corporate mentality, corporations run by very rich conservative men. What liberal bias are you talking about? I guess the question is, if the mainstream media is getting hit from the right and getting hit from the left, maybe they're getting it right. Is that a possibility?
No.
Somehow I expected that for the answer.
Well, I mean, I do understand. No, I mean, if you're an Ed Garvey leftist, I mean, obviously you're not seeing your views. I mean, if you believe that Dick Cheney blew up the World Trade Center, then you probably do feel that there's a right-wing conspiracy keeping you out of the news media.
Believes that.
No, I know that. No. I mean, I'm thinking of people like Kevin Barrett who believe that sort of thing. It is an interesting paradox that you have businesses that are often run by conservatives, not always. But ultimately, the media, and media is increasingly, it's a business, very much a business. On the other hand, the culture of the media is determined by the culture in the newsroom. And it is very difficult to influence from business executives. So I don't think that affects the daily decisions. What I think is puzzling is why the media doesn't make an intelligent business decision, which is to say, let's serve and answer all of our audience out there. I mean, let's look at the 10-county area of Milwaukee County. And a lot of people talk about talk radio seem to think we're one county. Let's take 10 counties. At best, it's divided red and blue. At best, there are as many conservatives as liberals. Why isn't there a more conservative columnist in the local newspaper than, say, Patrick McElaren? Where do conservatives go to have their point of view represented? If you're trying to sell a product to this group, why aren't they doing it? Now, and again, going back to the issue of talk radio, the only reason why talk radio became successful was because there was an opening in the marketplace. There was a niche in the marketplace. If conservatives felt that they were getting their news from other places, you would not have had a Rush Limbaugh. You wouldn't have shows like mine. But obviously, you have a huge number of consumers of news who see this on a daily basis. Now, again, from a lot of the folks in the media who say we must be getting this right, they're also saying at least half of our audience must be getting it wrong. What other business says that our customers don't know what they're talking about on a regular basis? There must be some sort of resistance to doing that because, quite frankly, what is our bread and butter, and I'll make no secret of this, because I certainly don't on the air, is that I like to talk about points of view and issues and stories that I think people are not going to hear about in other places. Now, obviously, there are going to be some things that are going to be just huge issues that will be talked about everywhere. The reaction to the president's speech tonight, everyone's going to talk about that. But obviously, there are certain points of view, whether it has to do with taxes or issues of culture or issues of education or crime, that are going to be handled on our station that I know in a way that's very different than you're going to find anywhere else.
Let's talk about politics for a second, because you had a brief dalliance with politics.
Yeah.
You worked for Milwaukee County Executive Dave Schultz for, how long was that?
It seemed like about 5 minutes. Yeah, it was about 10 months. Yeah,
10 months.
A short enough time that I've actually taken it off my resume.
It is actually, I noticed it's not mentioned.
I'm joking on that.
What did you learn from it?
Actually, that was a very interesting period. Because a lot of people in the media think you can't be tainted. You should never go inside because then you lose your media virginity thing, whatever that is. What I found was it is fascinating to see how decisions are made from the inside. And one of the things I learned was that on the outside, you can actually think that these guys are thinking about policy decisions and that, you know, they're talking about the things that we read in the headlines and talk about. What I realized was on the inside, it's about, I'd say 20% substance and policy. And it's about 80% personality and ring kissing and personal agendas and other just that kind of crap. And frankly, I don't think I would be able to talk about, you know, what happens in government quite as confidently as I do unless I know some of these guys and I know what they talk about when the doors are closed, the kind of the self-serving that goes on, the agendas that are completely different from what they say in public.
Do you like talking about politics now? I sense when I listen to you now, even in the last couple of years, that there's at times almost a distaste for talking about politics.
Really, that comes through.
Yeah. Well, I mean, is that an accurate assessment on my part?
Yeah, it is actually. That's very, very insightful. To a certain extent, two things. I mean, number one, after a while, you get bored with everything. I mean, so you get burned out on it. I mean, the politics is just, we've gone into a 24/7 cycle. We've had one nasty, vicious election after other, and after a while, it's like, oh, brother, not to mention the fact that it has become the level of cynicism, I think, or my personal level of cynicism continues to rise. So, yeah, you're right. There are days when I will come in, and I know that people think I have a political talk show, and I would rather talk about anything. I'd rather talk about my root canal than have to talk about politics. Now, and I also know that I got to pace myself because we're about to go into a year where it's going to be hard to get away from politics.
The old saying is that a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. You grew up in a household where your dad, who was, right, I guess, very much a liberal, Jay, wonderful guy. When did this happen for you? Was it a gradual evolution of your political philosophy, or did you have an event or two that said to you, I think this is how I think, and I no longer think that way?
It's so long ago now, you know.
How long ago?
No. I mean, actually, my dad was very much a liberal Democrat, but he was also from that the Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy. Although he wasn't a Kennedy fan, but that wing of the party. He was very active in the anti-war movement. He was the campaign director for Eugene McCarthy, who was the anti-Vietnam War candidate who ran against Lyndon Johnson. But I know that for him, this is getting to that story, he was, when the anti-war movement became overtly anti-American, and they trashed the UWM campus in 1970, and there were, demonstrators who were shutting down the library and harassing professors, and really, the chanting, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh is going to win. This sort of old Democrat saying, well, okay, it's one thing to say that we're wrong on the policy, it's another thing to actually be cheering military defeats of the United States. So he actually became more conservative as he got old. He was the president of the Wisconsin Civil Liberties Union, who became more conservative. And I think around that time, 70, 72, there were a couple of things. I think it was the sort of the beginning of political correctness. I always find it ironic when I hear people say that conservatives are intolerant. I mean, I'm sorry, you have never met intolerance until you have been around some, hyper condescending, elitist leftist. I mean, you want to talk about intolerance for ideas, and it's sort of, so I have little tolerance for that. But during that period, among a number of issues, I mean, the civil rights movement, it just turned around, at least in front of my eyes. It turned around from, and I grew up during the 1960s, from being, you should be judged by the content of your character, not by the color of your skin, to within like 5 years, if you believe that, you were a right-winger, because we had to, in fact, everything had to be color-coded. Everything had to be reversed. But I think it was a slower process. When I was a reporter at the newspaper, I still think I was probably somewhat liberal, or at least moderately liberal. And as I covered the stories, what I saw in story after story after story was one liberal social program after another that failed. It didn't do what it said it would do. And I started asking these questions. Okay, if the intent of the program is to do this, is anybody bothered by the fact that it is completely miserable, that these are completely either corrupt or ineffective or counterproductive? And when you start actually asking those questions, you come up with some difficult answers. So I think it was probably over that period of time.
You have written, I mentioned, 5 other books in addition to this one. A couple of them have dealt with academia. Mm-hmm. And the titles probably say as much as they need to say. One of them was called Hollow Men, and the other was called Prof Scam. You have talked and written a lot about education. What is it about academia that troubles you, frankly, as much as some of what passes for public education, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, I mean, I start from the assumption of that education is the most important social institution in society, that you don't pass on culture without education, that if you have an educational system that's dysfunctional, almost nothing else is going to be effective. So my first book actually was something I inherited from my dad. My father had actually written an article for Milwaukee Magazine, I was the editor of it at the time, called The Sorcerers in the 7.5-Hour Week, where he kind of wrote a Confessions of a University Professor about how little the professors actually saw kids, the pressure on academics not to spend time with undergraduates, and then the ridiculous stuff that passed for research. And it generated a huge reaction, his article. Unfortunately, from the time he handed in the article to the time it was published, he died. So a publisher contacted me afterwards and said, we would like to make a book out of this. And I sort of picked it up. So in answer to your question, I backed into education. And for most of the 90s, I was just fascinated by what was going on. Again, the contradiction between higher education, and I'm not talking about, I haven't been doing this for some time, but higher education that would charging increasing tuitions for undergraduates at the very same time when undergraduate education was becoming less and less and less and less significant. Institutions that claimed they were about academic freedom and the free flow of ideas, but which were enacting speech codes. So I always found that, I mean, I found the contradictions to be fascinating.
As I mentioned, education is a theme. One of your better-known books is The Dumbing Down of Our Kids.
Yeah.
And that really goes hand in hand to
Yeah.
a lot of what's written about in this book. How concerned are you about the state of education in this country?
Well, I'm very concerned. It goes back and forth. I do sense that there was a shift in recent years. People realize we have a problem. We go through these cycles in American society where we kind of dumb down the education, and then the Russians launched Sputnik in the late 1950s, and we decide, hey, wouldn't it be a great idea if we actually taught math and science? People looked around and said, we haven't been? Well, no, we need to do that. So you have math and science for a while, and then you get into the 1970s, and you get all the other kinds of fads in American education, and people start noticing kids aren't doing math, science, they can't read, they can't pass any tests, and you have these eras of reform. I think that we're perhaps in an era of reform. People are asking for a little bit more accountability on the part of education. But I think we're also having a barbelling effect in education that I haven't really talked about extensively because I'd like to actually put together some numbers on this. The barbelling effect is we have a number of really brilliant kids who are just doing outstandingly, like all of you in this room. And then we have this large underclass of kids who are just doing terribly. I mean, the kids who are graduating from college and not from high school, almost unqualified for anything. And unfortunately, that group is growing. We still have the elite group, and in the middle, we're having fewer and fewer, I think, in that middle group. And the problem is when you talk about the failures of American education, people will say, well, I don't know what you're talking about. I mean, I know kids from Marquette, or I know kids who go to Harvard, or kids who go to Georgetown. There is no educational problem. Well, yeah, we're not talking about those kids. We're talking about the failure of schools like MPS. And I will tell you, when I first started my radio show, the MPS, Milwaukee Public Schools, was a major topic. It's no longer a major topic, and I'll be really blunt about it. It's because I really can't sustain a conversation with people about it anymore, because I sense that most of the people who care most deeply about education have already voted with their feet and they're out of the system. And what we are seeing is the wholesale abandonment of urban education. So we are having
And Milwaukee is not an exception.
Milwaukee is not an exception at all. You know, it is not an exception at all, and it is, and that crisis is going to get worse before it gets better.
Let me stop with my questions and take some of your questions. Feel free to ask Charlie Sykes whatever you would like to ask. We'll begin up there. I'm going to try and repeat them too for our broadcast purposes, so go ahead.
Yeah.
Earlier on, you made some mention about your difficulty with taxes in general. Can I ask, how do we improve Milwaukee's education and public education in general if we're not willing to spend money on it?
Let me repeat that for, again, the audio purposes. How do we improve Milwaukee Public Schools if we're not willing to spend money on them in terms of higher taxes?
Okay, well, the premise of the question is false, because we do spend money on them. We spend $1 billion a year. We spend more per student on MPS students than virtually any student in the entire state. The whole notion that you just pump money into MPS, we've tried that over and over and over again, the increase in spending. The question is, what do you get for the money? What sort of accountability do you have for the money? Is it translating into the classroom? Is it translating into what goes on in terms of academic outcomes? Why isn't the dramatic increase in spending in MPS per student translating into increased performance in the test scores? So obviously money is not the sole answer. Now, as you know, I'm also a supporter of competition and school choice. The reality is, and this will be probably the shorter answer than you want, but we have public schools and we have private schools in this city that are doing extraordinary things. They are doing amazing things. They are turning out kids who can read and write and do math, are qualified to go on to advanced work in high school and college. The great question is, why aren't all of the other schools replicating what they are doing? What are the barriers that prevent the schools that are right next door from doing the exact same thing? And I'm talking about schools, the successful schools, that are confronting the problems of poverty and single parenthood and all of those other issues. So we have, it's not impossible. I mean, I know there are people who believe that the problems of poverty and social breakdown are so great that nothing we do will make a difference. In fact, I think that's kind of where society as a whole is going. I'm not going there on that. But I also don't think that simply giving the teachers union more money so they can pad their fringe benefits and their pension packages, or in MPS's case, their double pension packages, is actually going to do anything for the kids.
Let me take another question right here. Yeah.
My question is related to that as well, and it goes to the fact that the failure of the education system, how much of that is a failure to recognize failure of parents?
How much of a failure of the education system is directly related to the failure of parents to do their job?
It's absolutely huge. There's no question about it. And if anything has changed in my thinking over the last 10 years, it has been moving more toward the, okay, you can ask so much of the educational system, but only so much. Only so much. Because the reality is, unless society as a whole supports education, the schools aren't going to be able to succeed. In fact, one of the things in this book that apparently some people haven't quite picked up on, maybe it's because of my title is What Kids Don't Learn in School, this is aimed as much at parents as it is at teachers. In fact, one of the themes that I've picked up in recent years, particularly among teachers at the college level and the high school level, is how hard it is to deal with kids who come in with this sense of entitlement, that they deserve all the A's without having to work very hard. The parents are not going to back up the teachers. I mean, I come from, you want to talk about a grumpy old guy, I come from a generation where I just knew that if my teacher called home, I was going to get it. That my parent was not going to go to bat for me against the teacher. That was just not going to happen. Now teachers cannot count on the parents to support them. So I think that's a huge, huge factor, and I don't let people off the hook. But the question is, how do you avoid a situation where everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else? Will the schools say, hey, we can't do anything, it's those damn parents. Parents say, we can't do anything, it's those damn schools. What gets done? But there's no question about it. The role of parents is absolutely tremendous. And by the way, the worst stories you can tell about MPS can be told by MPS teachers who will ask an MPS teacher sometime, what was your last parent-teacher conference like? What was the last parent night at your school? How many parents of your students showed up? I mean, and those are scary stories, and you can't blame MPS for that, and you can't blame the teachers for that. You also can't blame MPS or the schools for the number of kids who don't show up. Because you know what? The world's best teacher can't teach a kid whose butt's not in the seat in front of him. So.
Next question. Let's go right here. Yeah.
What do you think about, actually, from Madison, in Madison, it's taken out all of the sugar? You can't bring sugar treats to school, parents can't bring them in. I mean, is this, it seems to me it's kind of overbearing in terms of schools doing that and also providing, school breakfast programs with these very specific things in order. How is that, do you think it's harming public education?
Well, okay, there's two separate questions there. Now you're talking about the bans on treats for like parties and stuff like that?
The bans on bringing in cakes and
Yeah, by the way,
things like that.
2 years from now, that's going to be universal. I'm just going to predict this because I just got an email this morning from the Kohler Public Schools that they're doing the exact same thing. And yeah, it relates directly to this whole bubble wrapping thing. It's like, okay, you know what? Kids and sugar. I mean, what are we going to do? Because if you ban those treats, those kids aren't going to have any sugar things at all. I mean, it's like there's a point at which, yeah, we're all protective. But at what point do we become overprotective? There are 8 schools in North Carolina that are actually raising funds right now to put up canopies over to the playgrounds so the kids won't have to play in the sun. I just want you to think about that for a minute. Because so for thousands of years, kids have played in the sun, but they can't now in North Carolina. You remember what you used to do when you didn't want to play in the sun? You'd go into a tree or something. I mean, in Cincinnati, and the Little League has banned chatter, batter, 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 swing, or, we need a pitcher, not a belly itcher. Because, of course, kids couldn't handle that. I mean, the number of people who are still dealing with the trauma of being called a belly itcher. So, I mean, it's at what point you go, okay, we're just not going to succeed in bubble wrapping the kids from anything. At some point, maybe if you teach kids, all right, you eat lots of candy, your teeth are going to fall out, you exercise a little bit of common sense. Unfortunately, though, we do have this sort of nanny generation, including parents, who I think have decided, no, we're going to regulate everything. We're going to stand there on the playground, no touching, no tag, no pushing on swings, none of which I'm making up. These are things that have all happened.
Let's take another question. Let's go up to the back.
Sykes, would you please comment on the impact of the fairness doctrine if we're trying to play either by the FCC or by congressional action?
Please comment on the fairness doctrine and whether or not we'll actually see a revival of the fairness doctrine.
I'm really glad you asked that question. Now, I have an article coming out, and I was going to call before I came here, and I didn't do it. An article coming out in Wisconsin Interest, which is the publication of the Wisconsin Policy Research Institute, on that particular subject. There's no question that the Democrats are going to try to bring back the fairness doctrine. They may think better of it the more they know about it. The short answer to the question is the fairness doctrine is not going to stop the explosion of political speech. It will shove it to a different side. I think the fairness, look, here's the way the fairness doctrine used to work. It used to say that if a radio or a television station talked about anything controversial, someone could go to the federal government and say, oh, they need to present the other side as well. It created an entire universe of regulatory control of speech. So let's say that some radio station back in 1964 broadcast in favor of an open housing law. If somebody said, okay, I want to run a piece opposed to the open housing law, we'd go to the FCC would pull all the newspapers, they would bring out the stopwatches, they would listen to the tapes, and you would have speech police in Washington determine whether or not they could compel the station to engage in certain kinds of speech that they wouldn't otherwise do. The actual result of that, of course, was that radio and television became brain dead. No controversial speech whatsoever because the cost of the regulation was just considered to be too burdensome. And can you imagine what the cost of regulation would be now that we have all of these radio stations, at least terrestrial radio stations, out there? You would have this massive government bureaucracy because that's the only way you enforce it. You would have lawyers and bureaucrats. That's one answer. The second is the law has evolved over the years. And I think that there's a very good chance that, you can never predict, of course, as you all know, very good chance that the courts would not sustain a renewed fairness doctrine. The courts, the fairness doctrine was dropped in the late 1980s, really voluntarily by the FCC because I think they saw the trends in constitutional law, the decisions being made by the Supreme Court and by the Court of Appeals that were essentially saying, look, this sort of speech regulation is really offensive to the First Amendment. Now, there's a lot of cases involved in that, but I do think it's going to be one of the biggest fights over the next few years. I'm assuming that there's going to be a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president. I think that they will be under tremendous pressure to do this, and I think people need to understand how the lines are going to be drawn on this, because this will essentially be one of the most naked plays by people in political office to suppress and harass political speech by political opponents that we have seen in a very long time in this country. And I think it's going to be a huge fight. And I think that the supporters of the Fairness Doctrine are going to have to explain why it is permissible for the federal government to regulate the speech on radio in a way that the courts would say would be blatantly unconstitutional if you were regulating it in a newspaper or in any other public speech forum.
As long as we're on this subject,
Yeah.
just let me ask a follow-up to that. You know, talk radio is a business, and it's about generating revenue. And I've always been struck by the fact that why aren't there shows where you have, in this market, for instance, where you have a conservative point of view and a liberal point of view, and they co-host the show together? It would seem to me, from a business standpoint, you'd have a better chance of attracting listeners from both political persuasions. Why does that not happen, in your opinion?
I think that's an excellent question, and I used to ask that question a lot because, going back to my criticism of the newspaper, that would seem to be the same issue with radio. The answer that I've gotten to that question has been the same reason why you don't have a station that has a liberal and a conservative talking to one another is exactly the same reason that you don't have a music radio station that alternates rap and country music. That basically listeners know what they want. They want to have a certain thing, and they're not compatible. The reality is, in the marketplace, if that would work, and it does seem like a good idea, I agree with you. If it would work, it would have worked someplace, but it doesn't. And I'm not sure why it doesn't work. I'm not totally sure why it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
But,
Other questions? Yes, sir.
This concept, Mr. Sykes, you have
Yeah.
soft and hard America.
yeah, Michael Barone, yeah.
Would you extend that to, red and blue America, to liberal and conservative America? Generation?
I think that there's some extension. I don't make it, it's not necessarily coterminous, but yeah, there's obviously, well, you saw the studies about how the conservative brains and liberal brains are different. I don't necessarily buy that, but yeah, I do think that there is a difference between hard and soft America. Hard America, tends to be much more conservative. The soft America tends to be much more liberal.
And
Yeah.
follow-up, I have a follow-up. It
Yeah.
seems to me that on the radio talk show, I don't know, in your experience, you've done this for years, that people tend to call to hear their own opinion of reified or affirmed. Mostly you get conservatives calling conservative radio, and you get a few people who call NPR. But that could be the reason why having the opposing views might not work. People like to call you or people conservatives or liberal to basically hear their views reinforced.
I think there's some truth to that. There is some truth to that. I mean, when you go back to what happened after the Fairness Doctrine was repealed, I mean, AM radio was kind of like this abandoned suburban strip mall. I mean, there's like tumbleweeds blowing through it, and a couple of wig stores, and payday check cashing places and stuff like that. And then the Fairness Doctrine was lifted, and suddenly these conservative stations these conservative shows started broadcasting, and they sort of grew and they grew and they grew. And I think it's because that up until then, conservatives, frankly, just didn't ever find a place where they heard people who were saying what they thought. They thought they were the only ones. And you really don't have any idea. I mean, liberals don't have any idea how hard it was to be a conservative, even back in the 1980s, because where would you turn to hear the kinds of issues and the kind of opinions that conservatives, just assume there's some sort of an alien breed out there. Time Magazine, Newsweek Magazine, ABC, CBS, NBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post. If you were a conservative, you might subscribe to National Review Magazine, maybe American Spectator, but that was pretty much it. So suddenly, people turned on the radio and they found people who agreed with them, people who talked about things that they thought were important, who expressed their opinions. And it was like pouring water on parched ground. So that's one of the reasons why it succeeded. My best theory on, you didn't ask me this yet, but why liberal talk radio hasn't been as successful is that the left does not feel that completely disenfranchised yet. That if you're a liberal, you know what liberal ideas are. I mean, you can't live in our society without really getting that perspective and that point of view. So therefore, you don't have that compulsion in the marketplace to go to some place where you would feel that people agree with you. So I mean, there is really the parallelism is pretty dramatic. I mean, conservative talk radio exploded because there was a huge market that was hungry for it. Air America has crashed and burned because, in fact, they can't find the audience that was, yearning for it.
Rick?
A variation on that question. A lot of people suspect that talk radio show hosts have their calls screened in order to yield callers who agree with them. Is that true?
No, in fact, exactly the opposite. We actually, on our station, my producers, we actually have a scoring system, and for the highest quality callers, the best talk topic, just from a purely technical point of view, will be when I set up a topic, express an opinion if I do have an opinion, and believe it or not, sometimes I don't. That's happened, and that the first caller disagrees strongly, because that disagreeing caller will spark other callers. That is the perfect setup for the caller. The quickest way to kill a topic is to have agree, except on really, really hot button issues. So intelligent callers. Now, of course, there are other callers who just want to call and, yell at you and stuff like that, which has its certain interest, I suppose, for listeners. But no, we actually, good counter callers are gold in radio.
Back here.
Charlie, I want to go back to Mike's question because it's related about having a liberal and conservative
Yeah.
back and forth. It seems to me that your best Sunday insight shows are where you have panelists who do take a different perspective, so you get some tay-to-tay back and forth.
Right.
When it's all on one side of the spectrum, I don't think you get as good a discussion of it.
Well, they're different shows. You're comparing a radio show with a television show, and my television show always has a balanced panel. I mean, we always have, try to have 2 and 2 or 2 and 3, whatever between that. But that's a television show. That's a different, each one of these medium, has some overlap, but they're not the same. And again, if in fact, I guess my challenge would be, if that's such a great idea, somebody with all these great media minds would have come up with it. Somebody in some city could point to, hey, you know what? We did that show, and that was the top-rated show. That's what the audience wanted. So until somebody does that, there are people who are a lot smarter than me in the radio business who haven't figured out how to make that work. Because it does on paper. If you don't do this, it does sound like it makes some sense.
So why does it work on TV?
Well, to be quite frankly, the pressure on a Sunday morning television show in terms of ratings is a hell of a lot different than the pressure on a radio show, as Mike will tell you.
It is a little different.
It's a little different.
Yes, Dean Pauly.
Tried to think the world through from a conservative perspective for a long time, and one of the tensions in conservative talk has to do with the differing senses of what binds humans one to another. And so I just invite you to think about, is there, from your perspective, a kind of conservative approach to community? Is that a concept that resonates with you at all, or as a kind of alternative to a simply market or contractual description of human relations?
You're asking me for a deep thought. You didn't say that there would be deep thoughts. Yeah. Actually, that's a very interesting question. And the answer to your question, which I can't really don't have time to flesh out, is yes, of course. There are tensions in conservatism. I mean, there are. In fact, when you talk about conservatism, it's sort of like describing dogs. I mean, there's big ones, there's small ones, there's libertarian conservatives, there's big government conservatives, there's small government conservatives. There are people who believe that we in fact have no obligation to one another whatsoever. We are a Darwinistic dog-eat-dog world, where the Ayn Rand types, selfishness is good on the one hand, versus people who would have a more faith-based communitarian approach. And you're absolutely right, there is, and I'm not sure where I put myself on that perspective. I think I would probably be on the not on the Ayn Rand side of it, although I have my days on that. But yeah, I think the conservatives have to believe in some sort of a community. That's not simply an economic and contractual thing. Yes.
How do you avoid burnout? You do these programs week after week, and you've indicated you're going to continue through the 2008 elections. I think it would be a real loss to the community if you stepped down after 2008. I'm probably one of the few who comes home every night and asks my wife, what did Charlie talk about today? And she calls me up to the office sometimes and says, you should tune in Charlie. He's really into something. So if others feel the
So you have married well. You have done well.
So I think it would be a real
Yeah.
loss. Your insight
Oh, well, thank you.
analysis
Yeah.
would be a real loss to this community. And I hope you can continue on.
Well.
And again, how do you avoid burning out with the frequency of your program?
That's a good question. I don't know. I wasn't planning on leaving after 08. I said I would be through 08. I think I have a contract through 10. But I take long weekends. I take long weekends and I turn off the phone and I don't read the internet. And we'll find out whether that works, I mean, there was actually, I've gone through time, part of, I guess, reaching a certain age is you realize these things come and go in cycles, and that you realize, okay, I'm going to get through this. It's really, really crappy for a while, and it won't last. Of course, you also have to realize it's really, really good for a while, and that won't last either. So, but thanks for the kind words.
Yes.
Mr. Sykes, I have a question about your latest book and about
Yes.
bubble wrap.
Yes.
When did it really begin, and what social forces got it going?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not exactly sure. This is not something that those of us who are baby boomers experienced. I think it is the baby boomer parents who are the bubble wrappers. And I guess my best theory on this is that we were the most pampered and doted upon generation, in the world. We were praised and everything. We didn't actually have to do much, but, everybody said how wonderful we were. And then we became parents, and we never actually had much adversity in our lives as much as we would like to praise ourselves. We didn't go through the Great Depression. We didn't fight and win World War II. So we didn't have any sense, like our parents did, that we had to raise tough and independent young kids. We wanted to be the perfect parents. I think we're the first generation of parents that really actively obsesses about whether our kids think we're cool or not. I can tell you, my dad never once thought about whether I thought he was cool. It would never have been in his, it just wouldn't have registered with him, and we do think that. So I think it's also kind of the rise of the therapeutic class as well. So I would say probably with the rise of the baby boomers as parents.
All right, thank you.
Yes.
Doesn't it mean that we are trying to make our children kinder and we are trying to give them better education? So maybe we are trying to protect some of those life crises so that they don't have to learn them so young, because they're going to hit them in the face. I don't know. And all we're trying to do is to slow that down. But does that mean that our children now are wimpier when so much of the education is saying that our kids are smarter than we are, which is a good thing, isn't it?
Okay, well, it depends what age we're talking about, and it depends on the specifics. I do understand that, but ultimately and again, you've articulated why we bubble wrap kids, because we want to kind of delay that. And to a certain extent, it would be kind of nice if we could delay the loss of innocence for kids. That would not be a terrible thing. But on the other hand, there was a weird story out of Great Britain where they were noticing the number of kids who were being killed in pedestrian accidents, and that it had sharply increased. And they were saying, why are so many kids walking into traffic? And the study would indicate that what had happened was that no kids were, essentially what happened was the parents had become so overprotective that they didn't let the kids cross the roads on their own. So in fact, they never taught their kids how to do it on their own. So if they weren't around mommy and daddy. So I guess here's the balance. You want to protect your kid, from, putting your hand down the garbage disposal. That's legitimate, On the other hand, sooner or later, they're going to have to figure out how to make these decisions on their own. And I don't know whether they're smarter than we are yet. We don't know. Are they better prepared? I actually think there's a chance that we are preparing a generation that is not only not prepared for real life and the decisions of real life, the fact that life is tough, being parents, being employers, being employees, that they're also not being prepared, to make these fundamental life decisions because we made them for them all the time. We are the helicopter parents. We just dropped my son off at college, and boy, you should have seen. You look up in the sky and all these helicopter parents over there, and the moms, and you think, have these kids ever, wiped their own noses, in 18 years? They're negotiating with the RAs and everything, and at some point you think, okay, the kids, like 18, 19 years old, they got into Georgetown, but mommy doesn't think they can do anything on their own, See, I guess part of the thing is that you kind of start off, they're like 4 or 5, and okay, it's okay. And then it's 6 or 7, that's fine. But you know what? When they're 17, 18, 19, and you're still, tapping them on the back to burp them, it's just gone too far,
We have time for maybe one more question, or maybe that's a good point. We'll take this one right here.
Completely inadequate. College graduate. Learning, yeah, from UWM. Yeah.
You went to Nicolay High School? Is
Yeah,
that correct?
Nicolay High School.
Nicolay High
where I got a
School.
completely inadequate high school education as well. Yeah.
What exactly do you mean by the phrase on the radio where you say standing up for what is right?
I don't think I say it. I actually think that the promotional people say it, but that's a cop-out. I don't know. I'm standing up for, what do you think it means?
Well, either you're making a stand on what you think is
Yeah.
right for society, or you're saying, I'm going to be the mouthpiece for the right side, the right wing.
Oh, a little creative ambiguity.
So I was wondering, what is your take on it?
Yeah, no, actually, historically, I think it goes back to, it's funny, after a while, you hear those things. It's both of those things, I think, no question about it. It goes back to the Ament pension scandal. Okay, do you remember when the county officials were caught ripping off the taxpayers? And at that point, remember Mark Belling has the standing up for Milwaukee, but he was kind of soft on all that, and we decided to be a little bit more aggressive on it. And we said, okay, he's standing up for Milwaukee, we're going to stand up for what's right. And there was a little bit of tug and pull there because we took the lead in bringing down Tom Ament and, trying to do that. So I think that was more, at that time, it was more about we're going to stand up for the right thing. And obviously the double meaning of being conservative is not unintended. I'm not going to pretend it was,
I'd like to say thanks to all of you again for attending today, and let's give a round of applause to Charlie Sykes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.